Is an ancient word, Kings 12. Rehoboam, already starting. Let me replay the tape. Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had come to Shechem to make him king. When Jeroboam, son of Nebat, heard of it, for he was still in Egypt, where he had fled from King Solomon, then Jeroboam returned from Egypt. And they sent and called him. And Jeroboam and all the assembly of Israel came and said to Rehoboam, "Your father made our yoke heavy. Now, therefore, lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke that he placed on us, and we will serve you." Rehoboam said to them, "Go away for 3 days, then come again to me." So the people went away. Then King Rehoboam took counsel with the older men, who had attended his father Solomon while he was still alive, saying, "How do you advise me to answer this people?" They answered him, "If you will be a servant to this people today and serve them, and speak good words to them when you answer them, then they will be your servants forever." But the king disregarded this advice, the advice that the older men gave him, and consulted with the young men who he had grown up with and now attended him. He said to them, "What do you advise that we answer this people who have said to me, 'Lighten the yoke and your father put on us'?" The young men who had grown up with him and said to him, "Thus you should say to this people who spoke to you, 'Your father made our yoke heavy, but you must lighten it for us.' Thus you should say to them, 'My little finger is thicker than my father's loins. Now, whereas my father laid on you a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions." So Jeroboam and all the people came to Rehoboam the 3rd day, as the king had said, "Come to me again the 3rd day." The king answered the people harshly. He disregarded the advice of the older men. He disregarded the advice the old men had given him and spoke to them according to the advice of the young men. "My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions." So the king did not listen to the people, because it was a turn of affairs brought about by the Lord, that he might fulfill his word, which the Lord had spoken by Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam, son of Nebat. When all Israel saw the king would not listen to them, the people answered the king, "What share do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Look now to your own house, O David." So Israel went away to their tents, but Rehoboam reigned over the Israelites who were living in the towns of Judah. Then Jeroboam built Shechem in the hill countries of Ephraim and resided there. He went out from there and built Penuel. Then Jeroboam said to himself, "Now the kingdom may well revert to the house of David, if this people continues to go up to the offer sacrifices in the house of the Lord of Jerusalem. The heart of this people will turn again to their master, King Rehoboam of Judah. They will kill me and return to King Rehoboam of Judah." So the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold. He said to the people, "You have gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up on the land of Egypt." He set one on Bethel, and the other he put in Dan. So we have a contemporary word. It's called choose by Carl Sandburg. Choose. The single clenched fist lifted and ready, or the open asking hand held out and waiting. Choose. For we meet by one or the other.
There's always more to the story. Always more to the story, whether we're reading the Bible or whether we're reading the news. There will be unfamiliar characters and strange places. There will be unexplained claims. In the case of this passage, even a campaign chant, to your tents, O Israel. So in this passage, what is happening? We have a story of the Israelite kingdom, a group of people who have one God and one covenant with that God. And it's only been perhaps 100 years that Israel has been a kingdom, a nation ruled by a king. Just as there are many situations in our lives today that have been established 100 years or 80 or 120, somewhere in this span of time where changes, things seem solid, and then they change. There's always more to the story. In the Bible, the first king was Saul, and then David's son Solomon. And Solomon was the first king who was born a prince. Both Saul and David had just come out of the people. There had been no king before. And Solomon built his realm on the model of the affluent neighbors. Now Solomon has died, and his son Rehoboam is to be crowned king. But already this nation of 12 tribes is beginning to fall apart. We see it in the news too, this challenge to establish nations in the face of devastation, in the face of conflict, of occupation, of war. It's not hard in some ways to connect this 3,000-year-old history with our present moment, because there's always more to the story. Now, the Bible tries to tell us why the kingdom fell apart. And most of the Bible tells us it's because the people worshipped other gods. You saw there Jeroboam putting the 2 calves in the shrines and asking the people to worship there instead of going to Jerusalem, worshiping other gods perhaps. But the other explanation is it's the ways of a king that lead to this fracture. Back in 1 Samuel, the people had been begging for a king, and God told Samuel, who was the prophet, to tell the people, and I'm not going to tell you everything because it's too long, but these will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons, appoint to his chariots and to be his horsemen. He'll appoint for himself commanders of thousands, and they will plow his ground and reap his harvest. He'll take your sons to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots, and your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He'll take the best of your fields and vineyards and your produce and your animals. That's what a king will do, said Samuel. And that is indeed what Solomon had done. And so the people of the 11 or 10 northern tribes, not Judah, where the capital was and where David had established the center of the kingdom, but people in the northern regions, the taxes and the draft and the enslavement, the labor, fell most heavily on the people of the north. Indeed, Solomon favored his own people of Judah. So this is what's happening here. The people have been having everything taken from them for the 40 years of Solomon's reign, so that Solomon could build palaces and temples and fortresses. And so the people of the north are tired of it, and they ask this new king, lighten the burden. But the story tells us, this is something that seems to be the more in every story, the king would not listen. The people of Israel had not been heard, and we can see too that the people of Palestine have not been heard. In the news today, their response was not a simple chant to your tents, but a small group who engaged in criminal activity, war crimes, who burst out of Gaza and murdered at least 1,400 people, took 200 or more hostages. A terrible impact on the families and the communities, and physical destruction. And the response of Israel: no, we will not lessen our burden on the people of Gaza. We will bomb you more. Another war crime. But there's always more to the story. The Bible can be read as words of oppression, and they are here, or liberation. The North Indian scholar Wungte Bukem says a government can have just rule, or it can have dehumanization, which is how his people and indigenous people of northern India have been treated. He talks about the yoke metaphor that is used here. It's a metaphor of political and religious subordination and subjection. And this tent metaphor, to your tents, O Israel. It's a metaphor of refuge. I hear that and I can't help but think. The Jabalia refugee camp, which is really now a small city, being bombed, not a refuge at all. So, in order to understand the biblical text and our own times, sometimes we have to listen to voices we have not yet heard, and sometimes we have to read against the interpretation that we're given. We have to say, you see it that way, you see it this way, you see it this way. We have to listen to each other. We have to listen to how we hear each other's voices. We have to be suspicious of a story that too smoothly covers over marginalization, oppression, subordination, subjection, war crimes. And we have to listen for the voices of resistance, the voices pointing us toward liberation. There is always more to the story. Rehoboam does not listen to the people. And so begins a pattern that has occurred in many nations. The biologist and historian Peter Turchin talks about this. He says there's a recurrent pattern in complex societies where an internal peace will be established. And over a century or so, more or less, things start to disintegrate. And what leads to this breakdown? Turchin asks. He says, It's what I would call a wealth pump. He says, a top-heavy society tips over. So these are the things that he says will lead to that breakdown, as it did in Israel and as it does in the United States today, as it does in Israel and Gaza. The first is population immiseration. The people are made miserable. In the United States, we see that the income of the majority, the vast majority of people, has not risen in 40 years, more than a little bit, while they have watched many grow very wealthy on the results of their labor. We see in Gaza a people pushed to the edge of their land, contained in that space like a prison camp, immiseration. And this is not to say that many other people in Israel and the West Bank, and indeed the whole region, have not experienced immiseration, because we only need to look back less than a century to see the Holocaust that really motivated the formation of Israel as we know it today. So start with that immiseration, and next you go to what Turchin calls overproduction of wealthy elites. He says there are something like 40 times the number of billionaires today than there were 40 years ago. But the population has certainly not increased by 40 times. So there are more and more of the super wealthy, and again, more and more millionaires. So these people who have so much money, they seek to turn their economic power into political power. And that's what we have certainly seen in our country. And then there is a significant portion of not the wealthy elites, but perhaps the more elite of those immiserated people who make a great push to escape their precarity, the precariousness of their lives. And so then there is an overproduction of these, what Turchin calls lower rank elites. People go to college, they go to law school, they seek to join the ranks of the well-to-do. But as I understand it, there are 3 times as many law school graduates as there are positions for attorneys. So we have people who have taken on great debt, and yet who cannot find the work that will help them pay for that debt. They are further immiserated. And it's not just attorneys. Turchin uses that example, and I didn't fish for more. So Turchin asks the big question, though, how do we get out of this? Is it possible to get out of this pattern that we have seen recurring over and over in history? Well, the U.S. did get out of it once. You may remember that in the early 20th century, there was a push to halt that wealth pump. We saw the New Deal. We saw higher taxes on the well-to-do. We saw jobs created for those without work. And this was a system that was sustained until about 40 years ago, when a new economic teaching took hold of the political class. We call it neo-orthodox economics, market economics. So Turchin says, yes, it's possible to get out of this crisis without major bloodshed. And he said, in the success stories, what we see is that we have what he calls pro-social elites, people who have some wealth and power, who persuade the rest of the elites, or enough of them, that with the rate of popular discontent, it's either going to be reform from above or revolution from below. And so they try to convince the other elites, let's reform from above. Let's tax ourselves more. Let's raise the minimum wage. Let's provide job security, health care, housing. So there are, Turchin has a number of historical case studies where this minority of pro-social elites were successful. But there are, of course, many where they were not. There always are some in that group, people who, if not share the misery of the people, commiserate with the people. Because there's always more to the story. If there is a radical reduction of the inequality, of de-immiseration, if there's a change in that direction, there may not be a violent rebellion, such as we have seen from a small number of perhaps some of the elite of Gaza, but who see themselves as miserable. So let's raise the standard of living for the people and shut down this wealth pump that redirects money upwards. There won't be immediate results. First off, it takes time, as Turchin says, to persuade the other idiots that this is what we need to do. Social systems themselves have a lot of inertia. It can take more than a decade before we see the effects, and this is a long-term process and a long-term commitment. Turchin notes that complex human societies need elites, they need rulers, administrators, thought leaders in order to function well. It's not that we want to get rid of people in those roles. We want to constrain them so that they will act for the benefit of all and not just themselves. Just how to do that, we don't have a recipe. So there's always more to the story. And there is, as you heard, even hope in the story. Hope. The pro-social elites, like Jeroboam, who listens to the people, who leads the people, at least for a while. I've been listening a lot this week. I've mentioned before my affection for podcasts, and I've been seeking some of the less mainstream stories. Stories that will make the picture of this current violence in Israel and Palestine more complex for me, more complicated. For example, think about the Bedouin people of Israel. These are people who were not pushed into Gaza and the West Bank, Arab people, Muslim people who live in Israel. Israel scarcely acknowledges them. They're not even counted for the census, although some of them do serve in the army. And there was a story this week I heard of a family, a Bedouin family, who found themselves in three roles in this time. In one, a son was on the beach and slaughtered there. In another, a son was driving a van One of the major occupations of this community in an industrialized time is driving transport vans. And this man had dropped people at a big festival, and he went to pick them up and was shot. They have members serving in the army, and they have members who were captured and taken into Gaza. There's a tension between the Bedouins and the Palestinians of Gaza and the West Bank. Are we all Arabs or are we not? There's a stress there. So I'm complicating my picture. Another short one. This will be a short one. There's an orphanage in Israel where a group of Ukrainian orphans were moved during the past couple of years to escape the war in their own country. Ukrainian Jewish orphans. And there was a story of one teenage girl who was out walking when she heard sirens. Now, she knew in Ukraine what to do when the siren went off, but she did not know in Israel. She was out there in the middle with no shelter. All she could do was to lie down on the ground and wait. Some of the orphans are saying, we'd rather be at home if this is the situation that we're in. They miss their home. They miss the Ukrainian people. They miss the landscape and the weather, all those things. But even better than listening to podcasts this week has been listening to real live people. We can start in our own communities. We all have friends, family, neighbors who have been hit hard by this situation. Last Thursday, the Interspiritual Inquiry Group at the Redwoods, which I was not the leader for, but they had a speaker, a Jewish woman who lives here in Mill Valley, and Sharon and I went together to hear her speak about what has her experience been in this time. And her situation, of course, is more complex than we ever know. Her grandparents were Holocaust survivors who ended up in Colombia. She grew up in Colombia. She moved to the United States. She has lived a number of years and traveled all over Israel. She is a woman of many cultures, and she is shaken in this time, as are her teenage sons at Tam High and at some other high schools. She and her partner have 4 teenage sons together. We listened to her, and we couldn't listen enough. It was just an hour. But for me, that listening was healing. For me, that listening made me less of a distraught observer and more of a participant in this community who can help to think about and shape maybe not what goes on in Israel and Palestine. I know that my letters to my representative, to my senators, to the president are a trickle. But it is a different thing that we can do here. We can listen. We do not have to be King Rehoboam, thinking he has all the knowledge and all the right advice. We can be people who listen. There's always more to the story. I can't help but pausing here to say that very briefly, my stand is that the war must stop. There must be a ceasefire. That is the first step toward somehow bringing this conflagration to a close, or at least to dampen it, to begin to be able to talk. There must be a ceasefire. The captives must be released on both sides. Israel has arrested people who were in Israel on work permits from Gaza, were there legally, and abruptly had their permits canceled and are now imprisoned. These people must be released and allowed to go home. The captives taken back to Gaza must be allowed to go home. But we must think deeply about these processes that shape such a time, the immiseration of vast numbers of people, the overproduction of elites with wealth and power, the overproduction of people who have the training, the aspiration to join that group, but not the opportunity. There's always more to the story. There is even hope in the story as we begin to understand the factors that create our current setting, as we begin to listen widely and deeply, as we begin ourselves to speak widely and deeply, as we recognize that we are part of this world, this country, this nation, and this community, this city, this county, this region. Because this is life. This is life, to listen, to listen, to listen. That we can do. We can listen. This is life. Amen.